here forever. Started my master's degree here in 1976. I got it in computer science and math, and I've been doing that kind of teaching for most of my life. I have a strong avocation, I call it, with consciousness studies. I've been reading about it for probably 30 years, and maybe even more seriously in the last 10. So I'm presenting myself tonight not as an expert on what I'm talking about, but as somebody who's an amateur in this and who's, intensely interested in consciousness studies. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to approach consciousness studies. So what I'm into personally lately is holotropic breathwork. I've done it now for a little over 8 years. I've probably done about 50 breathing sessions. So that's like my current interest. So the topic for tonight is LSD, holotropic breathwork, and the research of Stanislav Grof. Stanislav Grof is known worldwide, but in pockets. He's not known evenly around the world. So in my conversations with students, I get almost universally that nobody's ever heard of him. So I thought this would be a good thing for students to do. Over the past 16 months, I started sharing my experiences with the holotropic breathwork with some of my students. And slowly but surely, I've gotten some students to go up to Vermont with me. That's where I do it. It's a little small town in southern Vermont near the New York border called Paulette. There's a couple there, the Gibsons, Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson. Lenny's my age, Elizabeth's a few years younger than us. They've been doing these workshops for 20 years. They're highly trained. I'll say a little bit more about them later. But over the last 16 months, I've taken about 16 students up there. And I look over the audience tonight, I think there's only one here. Andrew is the only one here tonight of the 16 who's been up to Vermont. So maybe at some point we'll call on him to share his experience. So my talk tonight starts with LSD, and it's not a topic that's easily talked about, faculty to students. So we have, yeah, you can imagine. So I've had a few conversations, and what I'm finding out is a lot of students really don't know some basic knowledge. So this first part of the talk, I'd like to give you where LSD came from and its history. It was discovered by a man named Albert Hofmann. He was born in 1906 in Switzerland, and in 1906, I said that, and earned his Ph.D. in chemistry at the age of 23 in 1929. He was looking around for jobs. Apparently he had several job offers, but he liked what Sandoz company was doing, and went there, got hired there, and got assigned to a lab that was run by a man named Arthur Stoll, who was a Ph.D., and had done a lot of published research on ergot. Ergot and its derivatives were known to be helpful in obstetrics, gynecology, and migraine headaches. So that's the kind of research that they were working with. And Stoll was the older man, Hoffman was a young person out of school, and had a lot of ideas, and was trying to get Stoll to give him permission to do a certain line of research. I get a little nervous here talking about chemistry because I'm very weak in chemistry, right? But anyhow, Stoll said, yeah, I'll let you do it, but you need to understand that when you're working with ergot compounds, they're very unstable. So you may have some trouble. So anyhow, he worked on it, and he went through 25 different compounds. I've never read why the first 24 are not talked about. I suspect because they weren't stable and just never got produced or anything. But the 25th one was a synthetic compound that he synthesized with lysergic acid, which is natural, with an ergot derivative. So it became known as, I have a hard time pronouncing this, lysergic acid is easy, like I practiced this and I can't say it, diethylamide, right? So it got abbreviated as LSD, and it's the 25th compound that he was working on, so that's why it's called LSD 25. Now, he first synthesized that on November 16, 1938. So that's interesting because a lot of people think it was developed later, but that was the first development for it, and the standard testing in research labs was to test it on animals. They didn't do human testing. They did some of the standardized testing, and they found it uninteresting. The fact that the animals were reacting a little funny didn't seem to make it interesting, I don't know. But they discontinued that line of research. So 5 years later, in 1943, Hoffman, and I'm not sure what his motivation was, decided to resynthesize it because he had a suspicion that it was going to be more useful than they had originally judged. And during that resynthesis, that was a Friday, I presume towards the end of the workday, Friday, April 16, 1943. During the synthesis process, he seemed to have gotten some ingestion of the substance. Now, whether it was through a cut, who knows? Nobody really knows. And it really wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a sort of a dizzy experience. And he wrote in his journal a little paragraph about what that felt like. And he had to go home from work early. It doesn't say how he got home. I think it was a mild intoxication. But it was enough to make him interested, thinking that there's something here worth doing. So when he came back to work on that following Monday, April 19th, he consciously took 250 milligrams because in those days they thought that was a small dose. Okay, in terms of other things. Why are you laughing? Right. So they thought that was a small dose compared to other kind of tests that they were doing. Well, he had quite the experience, right? And he couldn't really function. And he had a lab assistant at the time, and he asked the lab assistant to take him home. Now, this was wartime, hope you understand, 1943, right? So they couldn't use automobiles, so they had to use their bicycles to ride home. So apparently it was quite a journey with the bicycle. And he has a description of it in his book. By the way, do you know the name of his book? LSD, My Problem Child? That was a book by Albert Hoffman writing the history of this. So anyhow, April 19th is now known in some quarters as Bicycle Day. Okay? I can't wait this semester to say Happy Bicycle Day, but I looked it up. It's a Sunday this year, so I'm not going to get to say that once. Right? Just to see who gets the reference, right? So anyhow, they thought that he reported his results to Dr. Stoll, and Dr. Stoll seemed really interested because it seemed like pretty amazing reaction. So Dr. Stoll experimented on himself, and they got some volunteers to also do it. And they thought that it was very, very promising. And Dr. Stoll had a son, Walter Stoll, who published a paper in 1947 that gained a lot of notoriety in Europe, and maybe other places in the world, but I know in Europe. And here's why they thought it was exciting. They thought that this drug could create what's called a model psychosis. In other words, not a true psychosis that you would see in a real-life human being who's psychotic, all right? But they could produce it in a normal person and then study it, and then it would wear off and the person would be normal again. So they called that a model psychosis, and it was really exciting because, you know, schizophrenia in particular is, you know, just considered very, very difficult to treat. So that there was a lot of excitement about this. So anyhow, let's see where I want to say. Yeah, so Sandoz, which by the way is a subsidiary of Novartis now, if you know Novartis, they sent out a lot of packages of samples to research facilities in several different countries. I think mostly Europe. I don't know if any of it made it to the States. But anyhow, people did the experiments on this, and the more they did the experiments, the more they realized that what happens in real psychosis was too different than what's happening under the influence of LSD. So that basically kind of gave up on that research for a while. Some people kept doing it, but the enthusiasm around it died down. Now I want you to understand the timeline here. So 43, the paper was published in 47, there's research going on. That kind of takes us into the early 50s when the original excitement about it kind of died down. Now I'd like to leave that story and take up another theme. So my talk tonight is about Stan Grof. So I want to talk to you about him a little bit. So he's a younger man than Hoffman was. He was born in July 1st, 1931. He's still alive. If you do the arithmetic, he'll be 84 this summer. And he's a robust guy. He looked like he could be a football player. And at 84, he's still pretty robust. He travels the world and is in pretty good shape. What you should know is that he was born in Prague, Czechoslovakia, which was under the communist control at the time. And one of his parents was Catholic, and there was a whole thing about whether his parents would be able to get married because of church and all that. Eventually they did, but the agreement was that they would bring up their children without religion. That's important to the story for what happened to Grof later. So just know that he was brought up without religion, so he grew up in an atheistic, materialistically oriented communist, right? As a young kid, that's just what he was brought up with. I didn't know this till recently, but the communists had two tracks for their education. One was that they were smart enough to take the elite kids and bring them on a separate track. So he was on that track. But he didn't have the ambitions that his life turned out to be. What his original intention was, he wanted to be an illustrator or a cartoonist. Cartoonist probably doesn't say it. It sounds a little, but an illustrator, because he was great at drawing, and he thought that's what his career was going to be. Another thing you should know is that in the communist world, Freud was not looked upon favorably. Now maybe some of the more advanced people were able to study him, but certainly not the young people in school. They weren't allowed to deal with Freud. So one of his classmates got a copy of Freud's book and smuggled it, and allowed Grof to read it one night. And he was so intrigued with it, he stayed up the whole night to read the book. And it turned his life around. So reading about psychoanalysis seemed very intriguing to him, and that's what he wanted to make his career in. So he changed his education track to be on a medical track so that he would receive an MD and get a specialty in psychiatry. So pick this up in that he's a medical student now, getting towards the end of his studying. In 1955, he was working in a lab with a doctor named Dr. George Ruchek. And Ruchek's lab had been the recipient of some of these samples from Sandoz. So they had been doing some of this LSD research, and he didn't know about it until 1955. So he started hearing about it and started getting interested in it. Now, one of the things that people doing research at that time, in that country anyhow, said that if you're going to do research on humans, right, you have to do the experiment on yourself first. So in 1956, a year later, after he got interested, he decided that he would take LSD to see what it would be like. And again, they had no research to say what a moderate dose would be. So I don't know what dose he took, but it was a heavy dose. What's really interesting about this story is the lab at the time was doing strobe light experiments. So they asked him if he would be willing to be part of that experiment too. So there's an onset, apparently, when you take LSD, all right? And just as it was starting to kick in, all right, they turned on the strobe lights. So he had this incredible experience. By the way, I don't want to forget to say this, but Stan has a brother, Paul, who's also a psychiatrist, and he was with him as a sitter during that time. This whole concept of a sitter is going to turn out to be important. I'll say more about that later. But Stan writes about this experience, that he was very grateful that he had his brother Paul while he was doing this, because he said the lab receded, right? Then Prague receded, then Czechoslovakia receded, then Europe receded, then the whole planet receded, and he wound up in some other place on the other side of the universe. So he was brought up an atheist materialist, and when he came back from this experience, he said he was a devotee of Shiva. So it was obviously a great experience for him, and had a huge impact on his life. Now, he finished his MD degree in 1957. I'm going to be throwing out some numbers, so I want you to remember that 56 was the year that he had his first experience, and the following year is when he got his official degree, and he decided that that's what he was going to do. He was going to make that his area of research. So he was also trained as a Freudian, so he went through 7 years of psychoanalysis. I don't know what you know about psychoanalysis, but it's a lot of talking, it's a lot of work, right? In 7 years, 3 times a week to a therapist to get trained in psychotherapy. So he was thoroughly trained as a Freudian. During this time, he was doing some more research, and in addition to his medical degree, he was working on a Ph.D. in medicine, and he finally finished that in 1965 from the Czechoslovakian Academy of Sciences. So what he did from 1956 to 1965, that's about 9 years, a little less than a decade, he did an extensive amount of LSD research, and he was known for taking copious notes. He had a huge volume of notes, and he was starting to see things that his materialistic upbringing and his Freudian training were not answering. But he didn't have a model to understand all his data. So what he tried to do was to try to categorize all that data. Now he says in his book that it's really, really hard to put all this data into nice, simple categories. But you need it for didactic purposes to kind of get a handle on what these experiences are like. So he came up with 4 different types of experiences. He sometimes refers to them as levels. I don't know if you're used to this, but Freud is considered the founder of depth psychology, right? So Jung is in that line with depth psychology. So he talks about levels and talks about going deeper. So these 4 categories are the following. The first one is abstract and aesthetic experiences, color, sound, right? The second category he labels as psychodynamic, okay? And he figured that Freud had pretty much addressed those issues, right? Then he found 2 additional categories that he couldn't explain. There seemed to be a lot of experiences that people were having around the process of being born. So he made up a word for that. He called it perinatal. Peri is a prefix that means near birth, right? So the whole category of experiences called perinatal. But then there were some really different experiences that seemed to have nothing to do with the individual. So he labeled those transpersonal experiences. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is talk a little bit more detail about those 4 categories. All right, so the first category is abstract and aesthetic experiences. So there's a lot of visual experience when you're on LSD. The 2 kinds of visual experiences seem to depend whether you keep your eyes open or you keep your eyes closed. And you know, this is a good time to say this. When I was preparing the talk and I realized how little time I have, and there's so many things I could say, I have to pick where I'm going to emphasize things. So there's a lot of detail about what the 2 different kinds of experiences are. So I'm going to have to leave that out. But here's the thing, people were reporting things about art, okay? They were particularly felt like they were learning what the Impressionists were all about, and they were learning what the, what's it called? Modern paintings, right? So people were saying that they look at a Van Gogh painting and they really got what Van Gogh was trying to do, all right? And they look at a Picasso painting, and I don't know about you, but I think Picasso's kind of an acquired taste, right? So they look at that and they got this sense that I really understood what Picasso was trying to do. So those are the kind of experiences. There was also a very strong hypersensitivity to sound. All right, like a little minor sound would be like crystal clear in someone's senses. And in terms of, you know, the great music, people under the influence of LSD report that they feel like they're really hearing music for the first time. It might be a familiar piece, but they have this sense like I never really heard it, like I'm hearing it now. So he labels those aesthetic experiences, or it might be just sort of an abstract experience too. Now, he thinks those are the most superficial experiences that people have under the influence of LSD. And he says those experiences don't reveal anything in the unconscious of the subject. And he said, for sure, they don't seem to have any psychodynamic significance. When I say psychodynamic, I mean in terms of what Freud was studying. But what really is interesting is that when I hear people talking about LSD, this is the kind of thing that they say. All right, you get talked about these kind of experiences. So I want to be really careful here, because in the past I've been a little glib, I'm going to confess. When I'm telling people about holotropic breathwork, I say, oh, it's a non-pharmacological way to have an LSD experience. Well, if what you've heard, or maybe even experienced yourself, is this first level, that doesn't really relate to the holotropic breathwork. Okay, you don't get those. People have some visual things during breathwork, but I don't think it matches up to what you hear on the street about these LSD experiences. Okay, so the next category is psychodynamic. Now, I could talk a lot about this, but I'll get me too far afield. It's basically what Freud studied, right? They seem to reveal the individual unconscious. So I don't know where you are in terms of your psychology, but it's pretty well established that we all have an unconscious, all right? But we have our own unconscious, all right? So what comes up is individual stuff in that unconscious. Now, Stan thought that most of this could be deciphered through Freudian principles, the principles of psychoanalytic theory. But he also saw some things at this level that he didn't think the Freudian principles explained. Now, make sure that you understand, because of the next thing I'm going to say. When I say the Freudian psychology, Freud was very adamant about psychology begins after birth. So you might say postnatal. So Freudian analysis is postnatal. But Stan said he found people having postnatal experiences that didn't get explained by Freudian analysis. So what he found was that there seems to be this leveling. There seems to be a leveling, sort of a constellation of memories that seem to have layers like an onion. So the idea is that perhaps at some point there's a seed event or a seed memory, and then life happens and things get layered over on that, and so that there's like a common theme, and that we can all have many of these different constellations. So he invented a phrase for that. He called them condensed experience, and then made an acronym out of that, COEX. All right. When I was preparing this, I said, uh-oh, this is dangerous territory, because I can talk a lot about COEX, and that'll chew up a lot of time. So I really want to get to the other two categories. So just know that this is something that Stan has discovered that is postnatal, but not explained by Freudian analysis. So let's go to the perinatal experiences. Now, he says definitely these are at a level below the Freudian level. So it's before birth, or near birth, around birth. He says the themes that come out of here are birth, death, and rebirth. So there's a birth, death, and rebirth theme that seems to be around all these experiences. And he came to the realization, he calls it a startling realization, that what happens at birth seems to be very similar than what happens at death. And that is kind of a challenge to think about that. He said that people having these kind of experiences, this is all under the influence of LSD now. I hope I haven't gone too far afield that you forgot that. Right? So he said that people were having, tapping into these deep repositories of spiritual and religious experiences. And he says what's really amazing is people who were committed materialist atheists were still having these kind of experiences under this influence. People were reporting what the experiences were like reliving their birth. Now, I've heard that phrase, and I've kind of wondered about it, right? When I do breath work, I say, okay, am I reliving my birth experience? And I have it in my head that I'm going to see a video. Relive the experience, it's going to be like a video. See, I suspect it's not like that. I think it's more like at a feeling level. You can feel what happened during that time. All right, so he says these are clearly beyond the Freudian level. I don't know if you know this, but there were 4 people who broke from Freud. Freud was very strict about where he wanted the limits of psychoanalysis to be. So one of those people who broke from him was a man named Otto Rank, and he wrote a book called The Trauma of Birth, because he was believing that birth, what happened around birth was really important. Right? So Grof refers to that as the Rankian level. So we got the Freudian level, under that, the Rankian level. Now, Stan felt that these kind of experiences fell into 4 categories. So he made up a name for these categories. He calls them basic perinatal matrices. Okay? So perinatal is the key word in there. These are the basic matrices or groups of experiences. So he divides them into 4 categories and numbers them just 1 to 4. So matrix number 1 is primal union with the mother. It's what's going on in the uterine before the onset of delivery. So this could be one of 2 things. Okay, the mother could be having this perfect pregnancy, and there's this oceanic feeling. Somebody's taking care of me. I'm warm. I'm getting fed. Got nothing to worry about. It's kind of like a heavenly feeling, right? Or if the mother has been on drugs or is suffering some kind of abuse from a family member while she's pregnant, all right, that could be a hell. All right? The second matrix is when the contractions start, and I never really knew this until recently, that when the mother's contractions start, you have these muscles that are really powerful muscles inside the mother, and they're going in this twisting motion, and they're impacting the fetus. So there's a physical impression on the fetus. So he calls this antagonism with the mother. Can you imagine? Oceanic, and all of a sudden I'm getting bombarded. So he said, this is an experience of universal engulfment, right? That like there's no exit. Think about it. The cervix hasn't opened yet, and something's pushing you, and so you can't get out. Those of you who know your existential philosopher, Sartre wrote a play called No Exit. The third matrix is called synergism with the mother. It's when the cervix opens and the baby passes through the birth canal, right? And this is the experience that people have, an experience of death and rebirth. It's a struggle, right? While you're passing through the birth canal. My friend Lenny always quotes Psalm 23. He thinks that famous line in there, though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil. He thinks that expression is coming out of this type of a memory. And finally, the fourth one is when the birth happens and there's a separation from the mother. So there's a termination of one kind of relationship with the mother, the symbiotic union, and the formation of a new type. So the spiritual experience here is the experience of ego death and rebirth. Okay, so those are the perinatal experiences. The fourth category is transpersonal experience. Now I feel like I need to say at this point that they were doing two kinds of experiments, LSD experiments with people. He calls them psycholytic and psychedelic. The psycholytic was smaller doses done over many iterations. So if you had somebody that was doing this kind of therapy, these kind of experiences tended not to show up until the later stages of that therapy. The psychedelic just meant that it was a higher dosage, and it was a little bit more aggressive kind of therapy. So sometimes these kind of experiences could come out earlier in that process. But the transpersonal experiences are characterized by the consciousness expands beyond the usual ego boundaries and the limitations of time and space. He says these kind of experiences fall into four major categories. The first one is he describes as a loosening of the ego boundaries. So there's a famous philosopher in the 50s named Alan Watts. He coined a phrase that a lot of people use, who I am is my skin-encapsulated ego, like that's me, all right? So he's saying there's a loosening of that boundary to encompass other individuals or other elements in the external world. A second category is that you maintain your identity, who you are, but you show up in a different form, time, place, or context. Okay? The third category is you lose your identity and you identify with some other being or entity. And the fourth category is you encompass elements with no continuity to ego identity. And it doesn't seem to be related to any of what we would call the 3D world or consensus reality. Check my watch. Okay, I think I'm doing okay. So this is kind of a lot here, and I don't know whether this will be helpful if I read these off, but I'm going to read them quickly to give you an idea of these transpersonal experiences. Maybe you've heard some of these before. But he decided to break this classification into experiences that have something to do with objective reality and some that seem to not have anything to do with objective reality. And within that, he divides them in terms of time and space. So this next category of group I'm going to read quickly is temporal expansion of consciousness. So it's an expansion of the consciousness of time. So some people have experiences around being an embryo or being a fetus. Some people have ancestral kind of experiences. Some people have group experiences, a collective or racial experiences. Some people have the experience of what he calls a phylogenetic or evolutionary experience. You have an experience of a whole evolutionary line. Some people have past life experiences. That's fairly well known, I think. Okay, other things are like precognition, clairvoyance, and clairaudience. The spatial ones, spatial expansion of consciousness, is an ego transcendence, an experience of dual unity, identification with other people, group identification, an animal identification. Some people have experiences where they identify with an animal or even with a plant. They have experience of oneness with life and all creation. They even have an experience of the consciousness of inorganic matter. Okay, I think most materialistically oriented people think that, okay, this thing doesn't have any consciousness. So some people have that experience. All right, planetary, extraplanetary, I don't know, you ever heard of astral projection? Some people think they'll wind up on the other side of the universe. Okay, and then the classic outer body experience. And then there's one more category. Instead of spatial expansion, we call it spatial constriction. So they actually have experiences of an organ or tissue, or even experiences down at the cell level. All right, now we're really getting kind of a little woo here in this last category. So experiences that don't seem to have anything to do with objective reality, or said another way, outside the framework of objective reality. So spiritistic or mediumistic experiences, experiences of encounters with superhuman spiritual entities, experiences of other universes, archetypal experiences, that kind of brings in Jung's work with the collective unconscious. I said that, mythological sequences, experiences of encounters with various deities, intuitive understanding of universal symbols, the activation of the chakras and arousal of the serpent power, the Kundalini experience, consciousness of the universal mind. Right, so those are some of the experiences that he labels as transpersonal. All right, I don't want to get into this too much, but I want to give you a brief history of psychology. Back in the 50s, or up to the 50s, the dominant model in psychology was behaviorism and Freud's psychoanalysis. A lot of people at the time were dissatisfied with that. So there's two famous names, Abraham Maslow and Anthony Stutich. Anybody know that name? I don't know if I'm pronouncing that name right. I think it's Stutich, something like that. Those two guys were trying to get together, and they said we need a broader kind of psychology, so they labeled it humanistic. But after that was out for a while, they began to see that even that was not encompassing enough. So there was a group of them that met in Menlo Park in California and said, we need to come up with a psychology that incorporates all of these kind of experiences. Now Stan was there, and he made the suggestion that it be called transpersonal psychology. So Stan is not only one of the founders of this discipline, but is the one credited with giving the name. The others went along with that. Now, Stan, in all his LSD research, was in Czechoslovakia. He got an invitation to present a paper in Long Island in 1965, so he came and did the paper. People were impressed, and he was getting invitations. He got an invitation to do a one-year fellowship from a foundation fund for research in psychiatry in New Haven, Connecticut. So he took that, spent the year here, went back to Prague. So then he got letters saying, come back, we want you to do some more. The one that he answered was a letter from Johns Hopkins University. He took a fellowship at their hospital called Spring Grove State Hospital. So I don't know, he doesn't write too much about this, but from what I've heard from other people in the stories, is that he actually used this opportunity to defect. So took him a long time from the communist authorities to get permission to come here. And when they finally agreed, he packed 2 large suitcases. I guess it was just a few pieces of clothes, and most of it was his notes. He had a tremendous number of notes. So he hadn't created a model yet, so that's what he was going to do when he came here. All right. Now, 1967, all right, is the time of Tim Leary and all that. So do you know about him? So a lot of people think that, you know, he really ruined a lot of things for people because he was telling everybody to turn on and tune out, you know. And it was a lot of self-experimentation without any safeguards. So people were having what they call a bad trip. I'm not an expert in all this stuff, but I have my suspicions about that, right? Now, from what I know about holotropic breathwork, it's really, really important, set and setting. Have you heard that phrase before, set and setting? Set is the psychological set, your preparation for whatever it is that you're going to do. Setting is obviously, it means the physical setting. Remember back, he said he was grateful that he had his brother Paul on that first trip. So set and setting was not part of Tim Leary's thing. So people were having these bad experiences. So I think you know the history. The government came down on it, and then it was prohibited. All right, and has been ever since. So that brings us up to, oh, and he was an assistant professor until 1973. So he did this research from 1956 to 1973, 17 years of very rigorous scientific LSD research, and because it was prohibited then, nobody's been able to match that since. Now, this is getting ahead of the story here a little bit, but there has been some movement recently about the government is starting to open the door a little bit and is allowing some research to happen. I'll say more about that a little bit later. All right, so what I want to do is kind of just do a little show and tell. When he got here to the United States in '67, he started writing some books. The first book was called Realms of the Human Unconscious. What he did is he re-editioned the book, and it's now called LSD, Doorway to the Numinous. All right, this is a systematic and comprehensive summary of the 17 years of this research. Can I ask you to help? Because I want to keep you doing this. All right, oh, that's not the next one. All right. This next one is called LSD Psychotherapy. It focuses on the practical aspects of actually doing treatment. Okay. And then he wrote another one called Beyond the Brain. This covers the heuristic potential of LSD research. So you can see he's the most published person on LSD. The next two I don't own the copies of this. One is the Adventure of Self-Discovery. This next one is The Cosmic Game. And then this one is about the ultimate journey. So one of the things that comes out of all this is birth, death, rebirth themes. So for every human being, this is a big question, okay? How do you relate to the fact that we all know that we're going to die? So it's a real hugely important issue for all of us, and this is a book about what he's discovered with people around that, and he calls it The Ultimate Journey. I'm probably going to forget this later, so let me say it now. We already mentioned Elizabeth and Lenny Gibson. All right. Elizabeth